All right, let's jump right into it. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're cutting straight to the core of what is arguably America's deepest fracture. We're going to examine exactly how the institution of slavery became this inescapable wedge issue, a giant fault line that completely split the United States economically, politically, and culturally.
To make sense of all this dense history, we're going to follow a timeline. We'll start with early divisions, look at the failed compromises as the country expanded westward, hit the breaking point, dive into the war itself, and finally unpack the lasting costs and legacy.
So, Part 1, A Nation Divided Early.
To really understand this, we actually have to rewind all the way back to the nation's birth in 1776. Right out of the gate, there was a foundational contradiction. The northern economy was rapidly industrializing, driven by manufacturing and a massive influx of immigrant labor looking for a fresh start. Meanwhile, the South became this deeply agricultural engine, completely and entirely reliant on the forced labor of enslaved people. Think of it like two totally different economic engines trying to drive the exact same car.
Then, in 1793, a massive curveball. Eli Whitney invents the cotton gin. This little machine was a total game changer. By making it incredibly easy to separate cotton fibers from seeds, it skyrocketed cotton profitability practically overnight. For the South, expanding enslaved labor went from being a regional practice to an absolute, non-negotiable economic imperative.
Moving on to Part 2, Expansion and Failed Compromises. So the U.S. starts growing, right? We're buying up massive chunks of land, like the Louisiana Purchase. And Congress? Well, they're sweating. They try this desperate balancing act using a concept called popular sovereignty. Basically, instead of taking a definitive federal stance on whether these new lands would allow slavery, politicians passed the buck. They said, hey, let's just let the people living in these new territories vote on it themselves.
You can literally see the panic in these rapid-fire Band-Aid solutions over the decades. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 literally drew a line in the sand across the continent. Then the Compromise of 1850 completely outraged the North because it included the Fugitive Slave Act, which forced Northerners to actually aid in capturing escaped slaves. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. But you know what? Each attempt at a fix only further inflamed the divide between abolitionists and slave owners.
Which brings us to Part 3, The Breaking Point.
That political pressure cooker, yeah, it totally boiled over. We're talking a shift from political debates to actual physical violence. We see the deadly looting of bleeding Kansas, then the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which absolutely outraged abolitionists by declaring that black people were not citizens under the U.S. Constitution. Extremism hits a peak with John Brown's armed raid on Harpers Ferry in 1859, and it all culminates in the 1860 election of Republican Abraham Lincoln.
So the massive cliffhanger here was, could the Union actually survive this 1860 election? Lincoln takes the White House on a platform specifically aimed at halting the expansion of slavery. But get this, he captured just under 40% of the popular vote and didn't receive a single electoral vote from the South, not one. The fragile Union was completely ready to snap.
And the dominoes start falling immediately. South Carolina, the Union's richest state at the time, pulls the plug and secedes in December 1860. Within weeks, boom, 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 Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana break away. By February 1861, Texas is out. They rapidly form the Confederate States of America, adopt their own flag, and elect Jefferson Davis as their president.
All right, Part 4, The Nation at War.
In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and that political battlefield became a very literal one. Now, logistically speaking, the Union had a massive advantage. We're talking 18.5 million people and extensive industrial railroads up against the South's 9.5 million residents. The Confederacy was basically forced into a desperate defensive war stretched across 770,000 square miles of territory.
Now, I really want you to let this number sink in. 3.5 million. Out of those 9.5 million people living in the Confederacy at the outbreak of the war, 3.5 million of them were enslaved. It is just a staggering reminder of the immense human element directly at the center of this devastating conflict.
Anyone hoping for a quick, bloodless resolution was in for a brutal reality check. The First Battle of Bull Run shattered that illusion immediately, and the conflict quickly morphed into a prolonged bloodbath. The Battle of Antietam saw 23,000 casualties in a single day, which actually gave Lincoln the political momentum he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Then came Gettysburg, the war's absolute bloodiest battle, and eventually General Sherman's destructive march to the sea, before Confederate General Robert E. Lee finally surrendered in April 1865.
Finally, let's look at Part 5, the cost and legacy.
When the guns finally fell silent, the nation faced an incomprehensible toll. Over 1,030,000 estimated total casualties. To put that into perspective, that was 3% of the entire American population at the time. It accounts for more American war dead than in all other U.S. wars combined.
Just weeks before he was tragically assassinated, President Lincoln stepped up for his second inaugural address and really tried to set a tone for healing. He famously pleaded with the country, saying, "With malice towards none, with charity for all, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds." But, the reality on the ground was a whole lot messier. Yes, the war legally ended slavery, absolutely, but true integration, that was basically a myth. Many freed individuals found themselves trapped working in squalid conditions for incredibly low wages. It really laid the tragic groundwork for a century of systemic segregation before the civil rights movement would eventually fight for equal status.
And that brings us to why we are still actively processing this conflict today. Historian Cody Mars really hits the nail on the head when he talks about modern debates over things like Confederate statues. He points out that these aren't just history lessons from the 1860s, they're retroactive stories. They reveal how different cultures within America still remember, frame, and grapple with that profound divide right now.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final question to chew on. How do these deep-rooted historical fractures, created by the institution of slavery, continue to shape American culture and politics today? The Civil War might have officially ended in 1865, but those economic and racial fault lines are absolutely still echoing through our modern society. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and I'll let you ponder that thought.